and gentlemen, we are on to our first session for the day. I know we have overrun a little bit, but I think that session was very, very important. Our speaker is in the house, Engineer Patrick Obath. I know he'll kill me for calling him Engineer Patrick Obath, but I think it's just important to recognize him. He's an engineer. So Patrick is in the house, and I would like to introduce Patrick before I invite him to say hello to you. And Patrick is going to be speaking to us on the topic of current affairs, global trends that are shaping leadership today. So who is Patrick Obath? Patrick is a consultant in energy, extractives, engineering, with special emphasis on leadership, governance, and sustainability. I know that to many of you, Patrick is not a new face. Patrick has wide experience in management at the national and international level in the oil and gas sector. He also has extensive experience in social, government and development issues. He's a regular resource person on governance, leadership, and sustainability issues in both Kenya and across Africa. He has local and international consultancy experience working with private companies as well as various international development agencies. He has been involved intimately in developing particularly the private sector in Kenya and in East Africa, being one of the founder members of KEPSA, chairing the KEPSA board, and he sits on very many boards currently. He holds a BSc in mechanical engineering. He's a member of the Energy Institute of the UK, Petroleum Institute of East Africa, among others. He is the immediate past chair of Standard Chartered Bank. He is currently the chairman of National Oil Corporation of Kenya, Adrian Kenya, PZ Carsons East Africa, African Alliance, Kenya Asset Management Limited, Java Africa, Java House Africa, and is also a non-executive director in companies involved in manufacturing, international development, automotive, FMCGs, ICT sector, so on and so forth. But I want to say why Patrick is so special to me. Patrick is special to me because one, I want to think of Patrick as a dear friend, but Patrick was one of my first bosses. When I joined Shell, Patrick was there. He was the MD of Shell. But most importantly, I owe my leadership journey to Patrick because I got an opportunity to go and work in the UK, but I was pregnant at the time. And I said to Patrick, I can't take this opportunity because I'm pregnant. He said, nonsense. Go and tell them you'll go next year. That's how my leadership journey began. So thank you, Patrick, for being a mentor to me and for looking out for women all the time. So let me invite you to say hello, Patrick, before we delve into the conversation.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And it's a pleasure always to be on this kind of forum. It's something that I really enjoy doing. I think the whole idea of bringing women together who are aspiring to be on boards, who are on boards already, and who are involved in those kind of things, it's a great thing, because I am a personal believer, and I've always believed that that the whole essence of diversity is not just women on boards, although that has been my key focus over quite some time. But the whole essence of bringing in diversity in any decision-making capacity always adds value to that decision, the decision that has been made, and makes it relevant to a lot more people, rather than when you have very much a sort of a single train of thought with the specific people. So, so for me, I think today is going to be a great day to have a chat. A lot is going on in the world. A lot is going on in this country. And one of the key things, and I'll expand a little bit more on that, is that the pace of change is very rapid in the world at the moment. And that is a challenge that we will all have to work with, that the pace of change is actually quite high. And if we sit and say, yeah, that we've done this and we continue doing it the same way, we probably get left behind. So Catherine, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm happy to be here and spend the next hour or so with you guys, and then take off to my next assignment, which should be straight after this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. So coming to the topic that we have asked you to speak about, which is current affairs, global trends shaping leadership today. And we know, and you have alluded to it, the world is changing, organizations are changing, people are changing, on a daily basis. What are some of the current leadership trends that you're seeing, and how are those trends impacting organizations?
Okay, there are a lot of trends that are going on, and each one of them is actually influencing the way we as leaders in the world have to manage our organizations. And I think one of the big things is just culture. The culture in an organization is a very important aspect that a leader must be able to understand. But it's not only the culture within the organization, but the culture within which the organization is operating. So if I were to go and work for, say, Shell in Nigeria, much as I know the culture within Shell, I would have to know the culture in Nigeria as well. And that way, as a leader, you are then able to mold the look and feel of your organization, both internally and to the outside world, so that it's relevant within that environment. The other thing is people tend to think of culture in countries. But even within this country called Kenya, if you go to different parts of Kenya, you have a different culture. And I'll put this out there. You go to the coast, there is a culture at the coast. And you come to Nairobi, there's a culture in Nairobi. You go to Kisumu, you go to Mandera. Each of those places has got a culture, an external culture. So within even a microcosm of a country, the whole essence of culture is very important in terms of being a leader and understanding the culture within and without the organization. And if you have employees working in Mombasa, that's a microculture within the organization, because the influences they have and what is happening around them is different from people who are in Nairobi, the fast pace of Nairobi and the more laid-back pace of Mombasa. That affects the way people in your own organization work. So I think that culture is important. But then therein comes the next challenge in terms of the trends in leadership. COVID has brought to us this whole idea of remote working. A lot of successful organizations have actually had this remote working as a way of working. People are sort of traveling around the world and everything else. And so they're very much digitally connected. A lot of us, it was thrown in our face by COVID. And we had to very quickly adjust. And your Zooms came up and your GoToMeeting, whatever, all these things came up. And now there's a whole plethora of items that connect us digitally. But when you have remote teams, that also brings a challenge in your culture. And this is a new area that actually all of us as leaders have to work on, because you're now having people that you're working remotely, and they will develop a culture of where they are, which you can't touch and feel, but which will come out in the conversations that you're having. So the whole area of blended working and culture within blended working is an evolving part of you as leaders beginning to understand how to work with that environment of blended working within and the culture of blended working. As we sometimes in the HR world, you say, that when you get the .com people, they work better between about 3 and 5 in the morning. But so they're not attending office, but they're working. And our sense of working before was sitting behind the desk from 8 to 4. But that is not the most productive time for certain people. So this whole essence of blended working and working in remote teams will create a challenge to us as leaders in the future. And we have to learn how to work with this challenge of blended working. And I think, and I'll spend a bit of time on this, Catherine, in terms of just going through the elements that I'd like to talk about in terms of the trends of leadership. I think the other thing is around, we used to think of an employee as somebody who's sitting behind a desk, and we manage the environment around the desk. So we were talking about ergonomics and the kind of chairs they sit on, you name it, and the lighting in the office, etc., furniture. And so we talked about people in the office. And that, as far as leaders thought, I've given them a comfortable place to work, and that's the end of the story. But the person, the employee, is bigger than the office space. They have a lot of influences that are coming in to sort of impact on how they work. So as a leader, you have to understand that the whole essence of the whole employee, their family, their friends, the environment in which they work, and in fact, the interrelationships within the organization, etc., are very important in terms of just understanding, defining employee well-being. So we've seen all these cases, I think, in the police force that we've seen recently of people committing suicide and shooting each other with guns, etc. We've had, unfortunately, some, and I've had some friends like that as well, whose children have jumped off, floors in a flat, or just decided to commit suicide, etc. All these things are showing that when you talk about employee well-being, it's no longer that space in which they're working that you control. It's a lot wider. So the interventions that you need as a leader, to design as a leader, are much bigger when you're talking about employee well-being. So that's another trend that is coming in terms of the expectation of leadership. And the one we talked about earlier on, which is just the pace of change as how things are happening. That is another thing as a leader. If you sort of think you've done it all, the company is working well, you'll be surprised that within 3 months, you may become completely irrelevant if you're not conscious of the changes that are happening around you and how they could, one, affect you positively, that you embrace them and bring them in, and secondly, how they could affect you negatively as an organization. So you learn how to manage those risks that are coming in as a result of the pace of change. And just talking about the sort of the social media space, for example, that is a place that something that you did 10 minutes ago could appear within an hour by your boss sacking you without you knowing. So when you talk about the pace of change, it's not just about the way of work, but it's around the environment in which we live. The pace of change is very high. And if we are not tuned into that pace of change, and also tuned our behavior as leaders to accept that that pace of change may affect us, and we need to understand how it can. So social media, internet, we are talking about just the change of technology and so forth. As leaders, you have to be fully conscious of the fact that this is happening. You don't have to be an expert, but you have to be fully conscious that it's happening and have people who can help you work around that kind of area. And I think the last item I'd like to talk about here, sorry, last but one, is around the fact that in leadership now, it is about personal accountability. Before you could work in, if you're working in a group, you're working in a company, the company did this, or the board did this, or, my boss did this, etc. It was out somebody else or the group. So it became the group that was sort of held accountable. But the higher up you go in leadership, the more lonely it becomes. And your personal accountability for the things that you do is actually the next thing that you have to worry about when you go up in leadership. And that accountability is becoming bigger and bigger. All these codes of ethics, what have you, and everything else, the higher up you go as a leader, the bigger the spotlight it is on you in terms of all those expectations. So personal accountability as a leader is a big thing. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is just the diversity that you're expected to manage. One of the things, obviously, with the Women on Boards network is around gender, and empowering, sort of bringing gender into the discussion. But let's just talk about the diversities that exist within a leader. Gender is a big one, and that is getting to the right place. Slowly, gradually, it's getting to the right place. But there is also generational diversity. You bring that into the equation. You got, you got the guys who I say work at 3 o'clock in the morning, and those of us who are used to 8 to 4. And even within those who are used to working 8 to 4, there's those who work better in the morning, those who work better in the afternoon. So all these diversities that come through, a leader has to be conscious of their presence and be able to bring all that together and make it work. Right? There's also diversities in terms of abilities, etc., etc. People who are differently abled. All that comes into this diversity that a leader has to be able to put together, and you're expected to do it. Before it was an option, you just could choose not to employ. But now you cannot ignore somebody because of their diversity. It has to come into the organization. And one of the things that obviously I used to, and Catherine may remember this, I said in Shell, we need to have somebody from every single ethnicity that we serve, so that when you're in the organization, you are able to have a conversation that is actually all inclusive. Obviously, we never got there because we couldn't get some of the key ethnicities that we have in the country. But those are some of the things that, as a leader, for you to be relevant and for you to perform in the future, has to come in as well. So let me stop there on just on the trends of leadership, Catherine, and sort of, if I maybe go to the next item.
Wow. You know, Patrick, I do remember us looking for a Chinese person because we had Chinese customers in Kenya and we couldn't find somebody. So yes. Looking for diversity. Talk to me a little bit about personal accountability as a leader, Patrick. And perhaps if you can share an example where you as a leader had to take personal responsibility. What lessons did you learn from it? What were the consequences of that action?
Yeah. Let me just share my board experience, and I think this is probably something that will resonate a lot with quite a lot of you sitting here. I served on the board of an international company that was based in London, was quoted on the stock exchange in London, and in that place, personal accountability is big if you're actually on the stock exchange in London. But it was on the second tier of the stock exchange, not the main one. And as a board, we made certain decisions in terms of investments that we had to make. And we got a whistleblower who told us that some of the investments that you've made, some of the money that you've invested somewhere else, was actually being done by your leadership, your management, your top management. And when we then found out that the CEO and the COO had been an arranger for us to pass money on to another organization, which is our partner, and then they got their commission out of that arrangement, which we had approved as a board, because what was given to us as a board paper met all the hurdles that we had. But what we didn't know was that these people who was giving us the board paper were actually benefiting from the arrangement that we made, which did not actually touch the company at all, because we lent the money to a third organization at a fee. It was LIBOR plus 1.5 or something like that. So the money that we had did not just go out and without making money for the company.
Patrick Obath.
So so in terms of the shareholder value, we were perfectly okay. So there's accountability in that level. But the fact that we allowed something to go wrong in the organization, and effectively the organization that the board on which board I was actually then suffered a very sharp drop in the share value. And as a result of that, we were almost being bankrupted. And from that, the stock exchange decided to come and investigate. And at that point, I became one of the people being investigated by ESCC in the UK, the Serious Fraud Office. So we had done everything correct, but our accountability, personal accountability, was to the company. And each of us was then on the board was treated as a suspect in terms of making it possible for that company's shares to drop by almost 90% in value. because of this activity that our management had done. And we went through the full investigation where we were not told whether we were going to be accused or whatever. Unfortunately for me, because we had done everything right, we had gotten consultants to advise us, we had all the minutes of the meetings, we had all the decisions that were taken, we even had recordings of the meetings that we had done. When the investigators did that, they found out that the board actually acted correctly by doing all the things they needed to do. And the COO and the CEO were eventually tried and jailed for 5 years each for the items that happened. So when you talk about personal accountability, the fact that you take an action, whatever decision you make, be it for the organization or otherwise, that decision, you are part of it as a person. And the key thing, if you're part of that decision-making team, if at any time you think that there is something that is not right, you must make sure that your doubts and your sort of suspicions and everything else, and the fact that you disagree is actually recorded in that particular place. And that is your accountability. A lot of times, those of us who sit on boards are afraid to put their foot down and say, I disagree. And the whole board says, no, you must do this, you must do that. Why you must come together and everything else. Why don't you know you are a majority and it must be good? If you disagree, you disagree. And please make sure, as Catherine and team know, all the company secretaries, it must be recorded in the minutes that you disagreed. Because that is your personal accountability. You come in as an expert, you come in as somebody who knows. But if you let that niggling doubt that you have and the fact that you got peer pressure then begin to push you towards the side that peer pressure is coming through, you may end up being in jail for not having stood up to say that this is not right. If it doesn't work your way and everybody else was right, it's great, you've learned something, right? But if it works the other way, then at least the whole board knew that something was wrong. And it's not bad. I mean, if you're wrong, you say, fine, guys, I thought that was my knowledge at the time. Now I know better, and you move on. So accountability, personal accountability is key when you talk about leadership in any position, whether you're in church, whether you're in, whether you're in a chama, whether you're in a board of a multinational, doesn't matter. Personal accountability is key. Catherine?
You know, Patrick, one of the things you may not know, or I don't know whether you know, is that when you sat on the board of Chemelil on behalf of Shell, you actually disagreed with a certain decision and you had it recorded. And it actually saved you a trip to Kiambu Road, where long after you had left Shell.
Oh, I'm not aware of that.
See, you know? So Patrick, you have been a leader in many organizations, you have chaired boards, so on and so forth. One of the trends that we are seeing is with regard to gender diversity and inclusion. And it's a whole new movement, as you have said. How does gender diversity and inclusion increase leadership potential and accountability?
I think gender diversity, for me, and it's an area that I'm very strong on. That diversity brings in to the equation. I mean, first of all, let's just go back to basics to facts. 50% of the world is women, period. So if you're going to appeal to 50% of the world, you have to have that 50-50 diversity. I don't go for 30%. I believe that is the demographic that exists. That's what it's got to be. It's got to be 50-50. And it means, therefore, that when you do that, the full range of ideas that need to be discussed are brought onto the table. And we then need to have a fully robust discussion around it, bringing all those views, because the 50% diversity either way represents a group of people who are bringing views on board. So within that 50% diversity that you have in an organization, each one of them also represents a different constituency. So you can see how that discussion then takes place. And the outcome would always be something that is very, very well balanced and will actually bring value to the organization. And it is not, I mean, it's not lost on people that organizations that have had, a very good diversity of people has been an organization that has been able to succeed in terms of the financials, in terms of their growth, in terms of that kind of stuff. And you can go to the NYSE, the stock exchange, you can go to the FTSEs and all the rest of it. You can go to Singapore, you can go to Hong Kong, look at the high performing companies. You'll find that they had diversity, very good diversity on their boards from a long time ago. And that is something that I think people are recognizing now. Some of them a bit late. There is still a small number of us, of the people who are on boards, who do not recognize that that is actually it's a value that would that you need to have. And it's not just in big companies, it is everywhere, even in organizations. And I think I spoke to Catherine recently about needing some women in a sports organization, which is a male sport, but we bring women in to basically give us a view around what is best for that kind of sport. So it is everywhere. It's not just, let's not just talk about the big organizations. It is in every aspect of life. So I hope I've answered I put that out, Catherine. I think
yes.
One of the other things is around growing diversity. And that is, I think, is a key thing in terms of growing diversity. And that starts from the very fact that you need to have it entrenched in the annals, in the policies of the organization. It has to be there right from scratch. And then it is not just giving lip service. And I talk about diversity two ways, right? Currently, we're on the hill of making sure that we've got the diversity has been well spread. So we have enough women in and men. But there are certain organizations where it's the other way around. So you actually got to bring it back to the same place, so that you got that diversity. And it doesn't matter whether it's a men's organization or a women's organization, but that diversity brings value into that discussion and the decision you have to make. So in order to grow people, you have to be purposeful or intentional in terms of, first of all, the input into the organization has to be right. So even at the time of recruiting, you have to recruit on that basis. And then you treat everybody exactly the same. If you find that there's a lady who's or organization who's got, somebody's mic is on. Okay, maybe it's a pocket phone, but okay, I'll continue. So if you find that there's a lady who has got certain areas of development, that development has got to be given, right? And it's given and given. But if they can't crack it, find another opportunity somewhere else. And this is not just because you're a woman, but it's because you're an employee that I value at the end of the day. And you make sure that at the end, by the time you said we have to part ways, you have tried everything to make sure that they're able to fit. And I know in my personal experience in life, I have been in certain jobs where I have found that job didn't quite work for me. And then I've asked, and then we talked to my boss and everything. I moved into another job and it's worked. And then I moved up. So I think the whole essence of leaders working to grow diversity, you have to start from the base and move up. And if we just think we're going to inject diversity at different levels, that is actually what I call transient diversity. But if you build it from the bottom, it means that your whole organization from the roots up is going to grow with a very balanced diversity that makes it good for the organization in the future. It's not just leadership where diversity makes sense. It is in the whole organization that diversity makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. Caroline, Omaya, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, good morning. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that in an organization, you might have people who work best at different hours. So as a leader, again, how do you balance that if you're finding some people might work best outside the prescribed office hours? And it's something you've mentioned we need to be conscious about. How do you create a balance within the team when you're doing that?
What you've got to do is to understand as an organization, what is it that you want out of your employees? Do you want them to sit at a desk and you count that as work? Or do you want them to give you output and then you count that as work? When you define what you want out of the employee, then you discuss as to what are the best ways of making you get that outcome, right? And if you have that honest conversation with the company, you may find that you need, you stretch what you used to call flexi time, right? To not just the fact that you can come in at 6 and leave at 3, or come in at 10 and leave at 6, but that the flexi time covers a full 24 hours. Now, that is a place whereby a lot of us will grow cold feet, because organizations have been, for even now, are actually programmed to work 8 to 4. And that is because, I want to call the government office, I want to do this, I want to do that, and those people work at that time. But if you have an organization that is a 24-hour operation, which is not manufacturing, but it's just normal, you would then make sure that the people who want to speak to the government, they will themselves create the time to speak to the government. You don't make that the reason to have an 8 to 4. I know I'm pushing the boundary a little bit, but really the creatives, like for example, if you look at now what I call the netizens, and you're looking at distributed working on a global basis, I may employ somebody who is in Australia to do certain things on the internet, and all I'm looking at is their output. That person will be sending me their report when I'm asleep, because that is the time that they've finished the work, they've done their work, and it's arriving to me at 4 o'clock in the morning, which is they've done it already. So what I value then is the output they've given, not the fact that they did it at 3 o'clock in the morning. So when we close our minds and say Patrick Obath is living next door and he must come 8 to 4, but the guy in Australia, I don't know what time he's working, but I've got the outcome. We have, as ourselves as leaders, have to be bold enough when we find that our demographic in the organization consists of people who work at those kind of hours. Are we bold enough to create that discussion amongst our leadership and also our shareholders and everybody else, and say, we are redesigning the organization to take this into position? So it's not a simple decision. It isn't something that you just decide on an HR policy to do it. You have to make it a whole company thing that you then work on and decide whether that's the way you're going to work. And can you imagine, when you've done that, it means that you become a global organization, because you can recruit anywhere. Because it doesn't matter what time the guy is working, so long as they deliver. But you've got to have a structure that makes sure that that delivery is useful, and how do you discipline, how do you work in, how do you assess, how do you do whatever it is. So it's not an easy thing. But all I'm saying is that as leaders of the future, that is what you're going to face as a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just wondering about boards and whether boards can start to work in that manner. What thoughts do you have?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yes, it actually is a reality. There are certain boards that sit on where some people are in the US, others are in whatever it is, and we always used to fly everywhere to come into a meeting room. And now you say you can do it from wherever you are. But because you've now opened the fact that you can do it from wherever you are, and you're doing it digitally with Zoom and everything else, all you're doing is blended. It means now that the time zone that people are operating at is different. So you've now got to design the time that you're going to have the meeting to take care of all that. And so it is possible. It is happening already. And I know some of the boards that sit on, that's what we do. We tend to meet at between 4 and 8 o'clock at night. That's the time that actually is able to capture most of the time zones where we're operating in. Sorry, it's between 3 and 7. 3 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 in the evening. That covers the US, it covers Europe, Africa, and the Far East as well. And then we change to early in the day, about midday, so that then the US guys have got an earlier start, and the guys in the East. So you design it, it will work. Catherine?
Thank you, Patrick. In the interest of time, I'm just going to allow 2 questions. I can see Lucy's hand is up. Lucy, please make it short, brief to the point. And then Umi, you ask your question, and then we can end the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I think for me, it's not a question, just to answer Caroline, who had a question. And Mr. Patrick, I think you've broken that down very well. But I think, Caroline, it's just a matter of instilling a culture of accountability. So it's not necessarily having, having different people have different ways and times of working should not be a problem. I think the output should be the issue. So what are they doing during the time that they're supposed to be engaged at work? So I think if you put mechanisms in place to ensure that there's accountability, and how you do that is ensure that goals are actually set. And when we talk about goal setting, it's another issue that is, is looked at as quite broad, and more often than not, even us as leaders may not necessarily really understand what goal setting is. Because you'll find somebody with 10 goals, they think those are 10 goals, but it's actually what they're supposed to be doing on a day-to-day basis. So if you set goals based on the strategic direction of your company, then you're able, to evaluate these people's work depending, or rather pegged onto those goals. So it means it doesn't matter if they work under a tree, it doesn't matter if they come in, at 7 and leave at midnight, as long as those goals are met. So it is the onus is on you now to put in place accountability measures and make it, work on it, and ensure that it's a culture, that your company has this culture of accountability, regardless of where someone is. In terms of the board perhaps working the same way, I think you've also answered it quite well. It's possible, because it's also now the board being accountable to the stakeholders and as fiduciaries of companies. So it doesn't matter how they meet, as long as they meet. And someone said it doesn't matter how the cat dies, as long as it dies. So if we, as a board or any board, decides this is what we are supposed to do in the year, this is our TOR, we have to find a way of doing it. If you can't show up in a meeting physically, you can show up online.
Right.
So I think it's just a matter of having an accountability culture.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Kristen says diversity brings value. Short statement, but weighty. I think it answers so many of our questions. Umi, just make it quick and short, please.
Good morning, everyone. Engineer Obath, thank you for the session. My question is about having younger board members. We're talking about global trends. What has been your experience? Are they adding value? What are the learning points? Thank you.
I think the key thing here, first of all, is to get young board members in. And that has been a struggle the same way that has been to get women onto boards. Because when you look at the times people advertise for boards, they're looking for experience of this, experience for that, etc., must have served in a senior organization. So you need to have been in a C-suite and all the rest of it before you qualify to be on a board. So it's had a very, the way boards have been recruiting, they've already had this block against getting younger people on boards. My view is different. When you set up a board, and you set up a board properly, you look at the skill sets that are required to deliver for that board. And once you know the skill sets that are required, you go and get the best person who's got that skill set. And then when you say they've got to be under 40 or under 35, then you bring in the relevance of today, because your population in Africa is 65% is under 35. So because of that, if you purposely as a board go out to do that, then you will get the younger people in. I've done that on 3 boards where we've actually gone out and said, we are going to recruit, but they must be under 40, right? In one of them, we actually said under 35. And people said, you're crazy. And I said, listen, people, the board experience, C-suite experience is not necessary. There are certain times that you need people who've got digital, they've got digital dexterity, for want of a better word, right? And those people are not us. We are the experienced people. We've served on boards, we've done everything else. We can't be in that space. So get somebody who is 35 who's going to disrupt the board. And the whole essence of digital stuff is about disruption. So you don't get somebody who's going to resist disruption. You get somebody who's going to bring in disruption into the board. And then I had to tell the board, we are going to have to learn how to work with somebody who is going to disrupt us. And that experience of us being disrupted will mean that the decisions we're making as a board are going to be better because we have experienced disruption as a board. But if you talk about disruption as one of these things that is happening out there, and you continue down the same way, you'll never get it. So I think the experience that I've had with young people on the board is because I have been intentional about getting them in with a purpose. And they come in their own rights because they're bringing in that skill. Board experience, you have 3 other people who are very experienced on the board. They can talk about board matters and governance and everything else. That person doesn't have to know about governance because they're bringing in the skill that they've come into. They can learn about governance. And if I, as a board chairman, can't teach them governance, then I need to be off that board. So certainly, Umi, for me, young people coming in, it is the mindset of the board that is important. And we have to prepare ourselves as boards in the future to have that diversity. And I talked about generational diversity earlier on. That is another aspect that needs to come into the board. And the last one where it worked for me, it was actually we said we need somebody who's under 35 with IT experience and who's a lady. So we actually put all that, all that diversity into the job description that you wanted, and we got it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. Before we end this session, just allow me to recognize a great friend and member of the network, and member of the network, Miss Marion Mwangi, who is the CEO of BOC. Marion has been a great friend of the network because she mentors many of our young members. She's one of our mentors. And Marion, I would like to bring you in and to just ask you to say hello to everybody. But as you do so, I want to pose a question to you. Being at the helm of your organization, one of the trends that we are seeing is that organizations are becoming flatter. The structures are becoming flatter and flatter. What is the impact of that trend on organizations and in particular on leadership styles? Over to you, Marion.
Morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Patrick. How very insightful, and Patrick is always doing something different. Just saying under 35, that's just amazing. On flat structure, I agree. It's the new trend. I think it's helping us get bigger and better ideas, especially around what the larger population wants. And in our industry, obviously, there's a new kind of patient, there's a new kind of person that's coming and consuming our products. So I think the considerations that we need to make as an organization, the flatter structure helps assist us with that. And Patrick has really given me this morning food for thought. That's all I would say now, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Marion, and always so nice to see you on these calls. And thank you for all the work that you're doing to mentor our members. I see Kristen is saying to me, some boards have board members who don't want to give space to fresh thoughts. How will this ever change? And I think those boards should be reported to Patrick so that Patrick can deal with the chair. Patrick, I want to thank you sincerely for coming this morning and sharing your thoughts with us. You have also been a friend to the network. You have been speaking at our functions every so often. We never tire of hearing from you. The wealth of experience you have is always very, very interesting and fresh, listening to it every time. And thank you so much. We don't take it for granted. So members, I think you have been sitting for a very long time. I want to suggest that we take a 10-minute break before we come back for the next session. But before we do that, allow me to just give Patrick the last word so that he can close off the session, and thereafter we go for the break. Over to you, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And I think my parting shot for this is just going to be that the future of leadership and the growth of leadership is a fast changing scene. And as leaders and potential leaders in the future, now and into the future, you have to create, when you get your set of tools as a leader, and in terms of the way you work, you must be fully conscious of this pace of change, because that is what has trumped leaders. And that pace of change, not only within the narrow space in which you're working, but the pace of change in the larger environment where we are, means that the way we work has got to change, and the way we think has got to change. And I'm always wondering, because of that high pace of change, whether strategy is still relevant or whether scenarios are more relevant. Because if you've got a high pace of change, then you've got to have scenarios that look at the likelihoods of change. And because they're happening so fast, they may happen within a very short period where strategy is just eaten up by pace. So just a thought to leave you with. And thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me. And thank you very much all for listening to me. It's been a great pleasure. For me, this is also part of my learning as I talk to people like yourselves. And I hope that we shall cross each other in the near future. Thank you very much.